Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, meet the beguiling belugas of the Arctic, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Eleanor Edye. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Rob, and hello everybody who's joining today. I hope your spring day is as beautiful as it is for me here in southwestern Manitoba in Canada, where we are just starting to see the last traces of snow disappear. Which probably means we're about 48 hours out from the ticks appearing, but I'm going to choose to focus on the good parts. And the good parts to me is that as we see the spring appearing and I start to look forward, I am starting to turn my thoughts to summer, and summer to me means beluga whale season. So I am one of our expedition leaders here with Natural Habitat Adventures. I have been working on our Churchill departures, and this is our polar bears and our beluga whales and our northern lights for a good long while now. And I will admit a very deep fondness for the beluga whale. And I had to start thinking about it recently because of an internal meeting we had, and I just got so excited thinking about how summer is coming up. I thought that this would be a great topic to share with you today. So what I want to do over the next hour or so is give you a brief snapshot into a whole bunch of different aspects of beluga whale biology. Everything from where did they come from in the first place, all the way through how are they evolved for the Arctic, and how might we see them and what kind of challenges are they facing today in terms of their conservation. Now, I will do my level best to keep this to an hour, and I'll try to be bang on, but I will say we cannot say everything there is to say about belugas in an hour. So any specific questions you've got, of course, feel free to pop that into that questions panel there. So let's start off and talk about whales in general, and then we'll narrow down to beluga whales specifically. This is a little chart here of the whales of the world, and this chart represents all of the extant, meaning currently living members of the cetacean group. So around 90 species of whales are extant in the global sphere. We say around 90, not because we don't know whether some exist or not, but because there's always a little bit of debate about whether one species is actually two or vice versa. So we go with the number 90 to keep everybody equally unhappy. So if you're here today, I hope you're here because you like whales, at least whales in general. You might be more knowledgeable about some whales. Maybe you've actually seen them either on trip or out your backyard, and if you happen to live somewhere where whales are regularly sighted. But when I look at this chart, and if you're watching on like a cell phone or something like that, you might not be able to see all the names. How many of these whales could you actually name without seeing them? I am a biologist. I work in areas with whales all the time, but I would still have to really work to even get like more than a half of these whales listed by sight. While we are drawn to them and we love to watch them and we love to go to areas where whales can be seen, there's both a lot of things that we don't know about whales, like in the grand scheme of things, but there's also a lot of really interesting things that pulls in human attention towards whales. And I'm going to shoot an arrow at you there. That is indeed pointing to our beluga whale, if you haven't picked it out yet. I think it tends to jump out in this chart, possibly because it's one of the only really pale whales. In fact, it's a totally white whale. And what is it that draws human attention into it? Well, it is one of the whales that's best represented in aquaria worldwide. So if you've ever gone to an area where there are cetaceans in captivity, whether it's for rehabilitation purposes or for entertainment, there's often beluga whales. So for many of us, even if we've never seen a blue whale or a fin whale or a humpback whale, you may have actually seen a beluga whale, despite the fact that they're sometimes hard to see and difficult to get to in nature. And I think another reason why we're so drawn into them is that they are, I would call them otherworldly. So they look different than all the other whales. And I think they do jump out from this chart as being something that stands apart from the others, at least to my human eyes. So let's take a brief minute here and talk about what are they? What makes that whale jump out as a beluga whale? Well, there it is there. We're pointing right at it. It is the only kind of very white whale. There are some other pale cetaceans out there, but the beluga whale is the only pure white one. And it exists in a very small family group called the Monodontidae with just the narwhal. So it doesn't have a lot of close whale relatives, just the beluga whale and the narwhal. And you can see that the beluga whale and the narwhal have kind of a very similar shape and similar size. And we'll talk about kind of some of those things that they both have or both don't have that makes them so well adapted for the Arctic. Because the narwhal is also an Arctic whale, we see a lot of overlap between the two species in terms of their evolutionary adaptations for the Arctic. I'll just bring up another picture of a beluga whale for you here. So they are a mid-sized whale ranging up to around 18 feet long, around 3,500 pounds, and that's for a big mature male that we're talking about here. There is sexual dimorphism, meaning that males and females are different, at least, to a whale's eye. And once you get your eye trained up as a human, you can start to see differences between them as well. Color-wise, they're the same. Size-wise, they are different. So females only reach around 80% of the size of males. And there's some differences in terms of as they age, how their flippers turn and things like that. But they can be very difficult to sex if you just see one by itself like this. As I said before, they are an Arctic whale, so they are found exclusively within the Arctic. They're not in the Antarctic, so it's not any cold water. They are only found in waters of the cold waters of the northern hemisphere, and they're found throughout different populations within the waters of the northern hemisphere. While we use the name beluga whale, that's one of the common names. It's the most common name, but they're sometimes also known as the white whale or the sea canary, which comes from some of the sounds that they can make. So I mentioned that they're one of the more popular whales to see in aquaria. They're one of the easier ones to keep sometimes. They're small-ish. They don't need a lot of space. Which makes it easy for us to go see them in captivity, but they are also popular as well to see in the wild. And I think they're really special, and I just have to stop every time I start thinking and talking about them because they hit you in such a special way. They really stand out as this white whale moving through the Arctic waters as this just otherworldly, ethereal, beautiful being. And they do give every impression because they are so well adapted to the Arctic that they've been there forever. But that's not actually the case. They are a very new species in terms of the evolutionary timescales. They're actually more recent on the stage than humans are. And whales as a whole are actually fairly new on the scene as well. And anytime we're thinking about an individual organism, which we're talking about here today, the beluga whales, I always find that it's really important to zoom back and look at the organisms that we're talking about in a bigger context, both in terms of their history and their ecology, because we can talk until the cows come home about how special beluga whales are. But what makes an animal so perfect in its place is the connections that it makes with other organisms and other perhaps non-biological things happening in its habitat. So we're going to look at them not in isolation, but as part of this larger historical context and their place within the larger Arctic marine ecosystem. So we won't spend forever on this. It's going to be a quick look through some of the ancestors of the species and a trip through whale evolution in general, with belugas specifically highlighted. And then we'll talk about how those belugas have moved through their evolutionary pathway to become so very successful in these waters where very, very little else lives and almost nothing else actually thrives. So we're going to take a step back in time, not that far back. If you're looking at the world as it sits here, it looks pretty similar to how we think of the world looking now. This is back in time around 55 million years ago at a time called the Eocene. And at this time, there were no whales of any kind. Whales had not yet evolved, and there were no whales on the evolutionary scene in any habitats. What was different in the Eocene was not so much where the continents were, but what the global temperatures were like. It was very, very hot, much hotter than today, around 9 to 14 degrees Celsius warmer than we experience globally today. And what that meant is that there were almost no ice shelves. Antarctica was not ice covered at all. Sea levels were higher, and there were lots of shallow, warm seas. So look at all the spaces here that are covered in that pale blue, where today you would find, coastlines. These were all shallow continental seas. What was in those seas? Well, if we go back, not 55 million years ago, but maybe 56 million years ago, not a whole heck of a lot. Think about the geological context of this and what happened about 10 million years before that. So 65 million years ago, we had, of course, the major mass extinction that we all think of when we think mass extinctions, specifically the one that caused the death of the dinosaurs and left no dinosaur lineages besides the one that gave us avian birds. This also took out every single marine predator that existed at that time. So there were lots of marine predators at the time of the dinosaurs, like the mosasaur, for example, that were present before that extinction period. And it really created this time of empty seas. It created an ecological niche that was left vacant. And the Earth took some time to recover from that asteroid impact to reach similar biodiversity levels, around 10 million years, taking us up to right here. Until we had enough fish and enough other living potential prey in the oceans that the Earth could start looking at the possibility of evolving and filling that niche of a large ocean predator, which for this time was not there. So what this gave us was the first whale. Now it's going to come up right away and you're going to say, Eleanor, that does not look like a whale. I don't know what you're talking about, but this was in fact the first whale that we know of, and I'll tell you how we know that right away. But this animal's name is Pachycetus. I'll scroll back for a second. So take a look at that star that came up on that map. This is where this fossil was found. So in the mountains of what is now Pakistan. So this was a land animal. You can see that looking at the artist's representation in the top right there. It's moving on land. It looks kind of dog-like or wolf-like. Clearly had, adaptations for being on land. And this animal, we have found fossil evidence of it ranging around 55 to 40 million years ago. So these animals belonging to this Pachycetus group, they were carnivorous, amphibious mammals. And while you might be looking at it now and saying, Eleanor, that looks like a dog, I don't know, again, what you're talking about, there are some things here that do jump out at us as being, hang on a second, maybe this animal is not as land-based as we thought. So one of the big things that I would point you at is to take a look at the skull, and then maybe to take a look at the artist's reconstruction at where the eye sockets are found on the animal. And think about how we don't often see wolves with their eyes right up on top of their head. This is a type of adaptation for ambush predators in shallow water, such as we see right now with animals like crocodiles and alligators. So animals that are able to, they can walk on land, yes. We would call them perhaps amphibious because they go between land and water. Land and water. And they are able to support some heavier bones in the water column as they hang out and wait for their prey to come by and ambush them. And their eyes are able to then remain as one of the only parts of the animal above the water so that they can see what's going on around them. So those eyes near the top of the head, the fact that it's got heavy bones for ballast and a very high placed snout as well, all point at it as being at least partially aquatic. Now, the reason we can say for sure that this is actually a whale and why it's classified as an early whale is to do with the type of auditory bulb. So the auditory structures within the skull of this animal are ones that are found only in the cetacean line. So there's a very specific kind of bony protuberance that's formed in the in the ear canals of cetaceans, because all of these whales, as we know them today, have no external ears. They have to be able to pick up sound through internal ears, and those ear structures are calcified, so they actually do fossilize extremely well. We find those same ear structures in an early stage in this animal right here. Now, because we were looking at an ocean that was pretty well void of large predators, speciation in the whales was able to happen very quickly. Nature does not like a vacuum, and it filled those spaces with all sorts of sometimes kind of wacky things that maybe didn't last that long. But it was a time when different aquatic predatory strategies could be tried out. So lots of whales, as we call them whales today, like this one here, this is Ambulocetus. Lots of these whales did not last very long because they were outcompeted by other things that came along afterwards. They weren't as adapted as they could have been for this new lifestyle. This guy has been interpreted as a walking whale. It's around a 10 foot long whale, obviously very different from modern whales again, but you can again start to see some of the similarities, maybe not with whales, but with crocodiles and alligators. So again, dense limb bones, really able to sink into them, partially webbed feet, great big mouths, hair starting to become more sparse, and eyes again right up on top of the head there. So these animals here, the Ambulocetus, only lasted around 4 to 5 million years. We say only, I mean, that's still a very long time, but they were then, they did go extinct, and we assume that they were outcompeted by other whales that came along that did better in the water itself. Because by about 40 million years ago, the ancestors to what we now know as modern whales had reached a completely aquatic predatory lifestyle. If you look at these two things here, the Dorudon and Basilosaurus, you can tell that these animals are not going to be climbing out and walking on land to sun themselves at all. These are aquatic animals. In fact, the name of that top one there, Basilosaurus, if you've taken any Latin or if you've had to listen to 5-year-olds talk to you about dinosaurs, this sounds like a dinosaur name, Basilosaurus. It actually means early lizard. Well, that's because the first people who dug up the first fossil of Basilosaurus thought it was a dinosaur, or a swimming reptile as we know them now, and they gave it a name to reflect that. Because of how scientific nomenclature works, even though we now know this was not a reptile, it does maintain that name, Basilosaurus, early reptile. So unfortunately for them, but you can see where the confusion would have come in. We can now kind of squint and start to see the ancestors to whales popping up pretty clearly there, but you could also squint and potentially see something more like a plesiosaur if you wanted to see that. Now, early on, all of the ancestors, or all of the cetaceans were known from the regions around Pakistan. By 35 million years ago, the fossils of cetaceans were global. So it took around 15 million years, but they made it into every single aquatic, saltwater habitat as one of the top predators, or if not the top predator in those ecosystems. So think about all those poor fish who thought they had just an easy time of it, and then these new predators appear. Life got a little bit harder. Now, that early radiation, this always seems to us, when we think about it now, we look back and we see that clear ladder of evolution, like, oh yes, our first whales were on land, and then the second whales were less on land and they had webbed feet, and then the next set of whales had bigger webs in their feet and they were less found on land, and by the fourth time we get to whales that were completely in the ocean. And of course, things don't happen in a straight line like this. When we look backwards, it's really easy to see, yes, of course, this is how we got to a blue whale today. But if you went back in time at around that 35 million year ago mark, you would have seen oceans full of whales, different whales than we have now, but they would still have been whales. And you wouldn't have been able to point at any one and say, well, this one's going to be successful or that one's not going to be successful. It's just one of those things that's a lot easier to do looking behind us than it would be to do at the time itself. Because this radiation happened very quickly and all sorts of different things were tried out by these cetaceans. A big split happened around 30 million years ago and gave us the ancestors of our two major groups of whales these days, which are our toothed whales and our baleen whales. So baleen whales, like the blue whale that's shown here, consume usually small pieces of food, things like plankton, by filter feeding through plates of baleen. So it's a type of keratin plate that hangs down from the roof of their mouth. So they come across a big batch of plankton, they open their mouths, they scoop it up, they close their mouths, they use the muscles in their throat to push out the water, holding the plankton inside, then they eat that. So that was the big split that led to either that life strategy or the toothed whales, which gives us whales like our beluga whale or our narwhal or all of the dolphins and porpoises you could possibly think of, including the killer whale. So that was a big split and gave us major differences with the feeding strategy and also into which whales can echolocate and which are either not able or basically not able to echolocate. Our echolocators are all the toothed whales. Baleen whales, if they have any echolocation abilities, it's very minimal. So that was our biggest splits. And what that means is that about 34, 35 million years ago represents the last common ancestor of all modern whales. And we don't know what that was, at least as of right now. We can just make guesses based on the fossil record and based on what kind of adaptations were needed at the time. But let's jump on, because we talked, I think, pretty well now about what gave us whales and how they came to be, and then that radiation continued. So once those toothed whales were a distinct division, they did go on and produce all of the modern cetaceans within the toothed whale group, one of which is that family Monodontidae. Now, I said before Monodontidae only has two species in it. Monodontidae means single tooth, so it's named for the narwhals, which have that single tooth that erupts out of the male's upper jaw, forming that tusk. But it also includes the beluga whales. Now, the Monodontidae family, very recent family, again, evolutionarily speaking. And in fact, even though the two whales who are now currently found in Monodontidae are just northern hemisphere cold water whales, and you can see them here, where the light blue up at the top of that range map is the narwhal range, and the kind of peachy color is the beluga whale range. So they're only found in northern areas. They actually, looks like they speciated out in equatorial zones around 2.5 to 3 million years ago. And the reason we think that they were there at the time is that about 2.5 million years ago, we were looking at a glacial maximum. So the Earth was quite a bit colder than it is today. Ice sheets covered a lot of the terrestrial areas, and there were actually a lot of water that was bound up in sea ice as well. So if you were a whale who was needing to specialize in cold water habitats, you actually wouldn't be 2.5 million years ago, you wouldn't be up in what we now know as the Arctic. You would be in actually probably a latitude similar to Florida if you wanted to be following the edge of that ice sheet. So the fossils, and you can see the fossils that have been found from some of these ancestors of our modern belugas, they're marked with the green dots. They're all found around the equatorial latitudes there. And we start to see what we recognize as modern day beluga and narwhal remains and fossils from around that 2.5 million year ago mark, following our current distribution patterns. So that's what got us to having beluga whales. A whole bunch of stuff happened. Dinosaurs got wiped out. The Earth got really warm. The oceans were empty, the oceans filled up, and then everything got cold and difficult again. And the belugas were born of this cold, difficult time. And as those ice sheets receded, they followed them along, giving us our modern range of the beluga whale today. And in terms of how many beluga whales there are living these days, we have a worldwide population estimate of 160,000 individuals. This is an estimate from the IUCN, excuse me, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The IUCN rates the beluga whale as a species of least concern, not meaning that there's no possibility ever that beluga whales will go extinct, but basically saying in the grand scheme of things, if we look at every other organism out there, beluga whales, our concern level is right near the bottom. That being said, there are some endangered populations, which we'll talk about. In this map, we are looking down from the North Pole down onto the Northern Hemisphere. The colored areas that are in yellow or in hatched yellow represent the overall distribution or range of the beluga whales. The hatched areas represent specifically their summering areas because many of these populations are migratory and will move into other areas in the summer. So if you think about that range map and you look here at the sea ice, here I'll go back for a second so you can pay attention. So there is where our beluga whales are found. And coming up, here is where our ice is found. So this is a map from a couple of years ago, but it was the maximum sea ice extent. And the maximum sea ice extent is usually reached in March in the Northern Hemisphere. And you can see that basically wherever there is ice, there is beluga whales. Sorry, I should say wherever there is seasonal ice, there are beluga whales. Up in the very center of that map, you'll have that persistent ice pack, that multi-year ice that remains near the North Pole. Beluga whales don't want to use that habitat. That's no good for them. They don't like being covered by ice, but they want to be where the ice comes and goes. So from this, we really do get the idea that the beluga whales are truly a species of the icy seas. They have been since they evolved. They continue to be. Where there is ice, the beluga whales will follow, and that will become their habitat. And what has made them chase this ice and become so well adapted to the Arctic is so very, very many things. Their very name, Delphinapterus lucus. Delphinapterus means dolphin without a fin, and lucus means white. So we have here our white whale without a fin. And you can see looking at this beautiful picture of these whales kind of coming up to breathe and then rolling over, showing you their backs, they do not have a dorsal fin. This is similar to the narwhal as well as the bowhead whales, our other two species of Arctic whales. They do not have dorsal fins. And if you can look at these whales and look at all that's around these whales and think about how these whales have to breathe at least every 20 minutes or so, and they have to be able to move around this ice-filled habitat and get to these open water areas. And they've got to do that. Of course, the ice is not flat under the water. It's full of crevasses and valleys and things that poke out. You want your body to be as streamlined as possible, and anything that sticks out and potentially might catch you up on the ice is something that's very disadvantageous to you. So having a no dorsal fin gives them much greater maneuverability. They're also able to then use their backs to actually break ice, and they can break ice up to about 8 inches thick, just pushing up with force using that dorsal ridge. That is, it's much harder than the surrounding skin, but it's not a bony protuberance or anything like that. What the flip side of this is that whales that possess that dorsal fin, it acts like the keel of a boat. They're able to move very quickly while keeping themselves in line in the water column. If you lose that keel, you lose the ability to hold yourself in a straight fashion as you move quickly. So our beluga whales, as well as our narwhals and bowhead whales by extension, are not able to be fast movers. Their fastest recording swimming speed was, I have it in kilometers per hour, 27.5 kilometers per hour. So is that like 17 miles an hour? It's top speed. That's them going rocket fast. That's not very fast in a whale's world. So they are normally plotters. They move at what would be a gentle walking speed for us, around 1 to 10 kilometers per hour, or less than 1 mile to around 5 miles per hour. So not the world's cheetahs of the ocean here. Other things that have made them very well adapted to these Arctic icy waters is something that's very unique within the Arctic whales again, and these are unfused neck vertebrae. If you take a look at this whale, took this just on the edge of a boat, looking off into the water at this whale, and you can see that this whale has turned its head and is looking back up at you. And this is actually something that I think is really special that we sometimes get to see when we're on expedition, but it's also demonstrating how maneuverable this whale is. Other whales, again, those really fast whales, think about let's take a killer whale as an example. They've got that huge dorsal fin that's keeping them steady. And if you're going really fast, you don't want the water catching like your nose and pulling your head backwards and moving in every which way. You want to be able to hold everything in line. So other fast whales, like the killer whale, have their vertebrae fused. So they are actually not able to turn their heads at all. They have to keep looking forward. If they want to look at something, they have to move their whole bodies. Beluga whales, again, not the cheetahs of the ocean here, they are able to move their heads around because that maneuverability is much more advantageous for them in that icy, dark water than having speed. With this again, also things that point at not very speedy here. They also have small fins relative to their body size. This helps them again not be very fast and be more maneuverable, but this is also for heat control. So they're not losing a lot of heat to their sticky outy bits like their fins there. I know it's hard to believe, but I'm going to tell you that these are prime bodies here for living in the Arctic. So they are very, very streamlined. This is not my photo, but I love it so very much. This was taken by a photographer named David Marin in, I believe, just off Somerset Island. And this gorgeous photo, which I really need to get framed on my wall somewhere, because can you imagine a happier looking beluga? It's hard to do. They are by weight about 40 to 50% body fats. And that is not to be overlooked easily. So most of that is not in the kind of fat like you and I would have. That's, fat that's being stored as in case there's a famine next week and we can't get to our chocolate cake anymore. This fat is stored as a particular kind of fat called blubber. And blubber is different in that it acts as a thermal insulator, but it's also more vascularized. So it has a lot of blood vessels that run through it relative to like fat that might be on you or I, which actually has almost no blood supply. It's one of the reasons why it's so hard to get off of you is because it's not vascularized. So the fact that it's vascularized is actually considered to be connective tissue, and they are able to, with muscles that are specifically for this purpose, they're able to shape how their blubber sits to a certain extent to make it more streamlined. Blubber has a lot of advantages over fur. You might think of an animal like a polar bear or a sea otter or a seal and say, well, why pack on this weight? Isn't this a lot of weight to move? Isn't it hard to get that much fat? Why is it advantageous? Why do whales have blubber? Well, the main reason whales have blubber instead of fur is that as whales can dive, the blubber does not compress under pressure and it retains its insulating capacity. If you were a sea otter, for example, that was diving in the water, most of the way that hair is retaining heat is by actually holding pockets of air. And if a sea otter dives far enough, that air gets expelled from their fur coat and it doesn't keep them warm anymore. So blubber aids in streamlining, it aids in heat retention, it aids in buoyancy, and it is just so incredibly beautiful, obviously. Now, if we think about the Arctic, and a lot of the pictures I've shown have shown very little in the backgrounds because there's not a whole lot to see. It takes an awful lot to get a fat whale in the Arctic. we often think of it as pretty barren, and in some ways it is. So we really have to think about the larger food web and where these calories are coming from. Because fat, from the very, the small animals all the way up to something like a beluga whale or a polar bear, the fat is the currency of the Arctic. It's the thing that everything is looking for. It's a very energy dense storage molecule that's sought after by absolutely every animal that is in the Arctic. And this all starts with our primary producers. We don't think of the Arctic as being a very high production ecosystem, and in some ways it's not, right? If you look at the sea ice, it looks pretty barren, and in many ways it is. But if you were to take a core of the sea ice, like this researcher has done here, to demonstrate, you can see that brown ring at the bottom of that ice core. That is actually a ring of photosynthetic algae that's found within the sea ice. And that phytoplankton, those small, tiny little plants, will colonize cracks in the sea ice as well as the rough bottom of the ice. And you can think of the upside down ice as being like the soil of the Arctic. It's the garden where everything is growing on. And it might not look like the Amazon basin. It may not be incredibly diverse, but altogether, these tiny little phytoplanktons, these algae, produce a huge amount of energy by collecting it during these long polar polar daylight hours where it may be 24 hours a day of daylight in places. And this algae supports everything that comes from above it and everything higher up the trophic chain. In terms of how much it produces, well, again, relative to other areas, this is a map of primary production across the globe. And basically, the bluer colors represent less productive areas, and the greens and yellows represent more productive areas. And this is over the course of an annual average. When we look at those waters around the tropics, they are actually not very productive areas. And there's a host of reasons for that. Some to do with nutrition, some to do with it just being too hot, some to do with oxygen levels. But the short story is, if you want to be a plant who grows in huge amounts in the ocean, the place to be is as close to the poles as you can get. And you can see that bright green and even going into yellow in some areas and red of that upper Arctic. So those high latitudes are considerably more productive than tropical latitudes. And lots of animals will actually migrate up to take advantage of that during the summer. So when you see the migrations of the humpbacks and the blue whales and other whales coming in, they're trying to take advantage of the summer. The beluga whale is just staying there year round. And you can actually see these algal blooms using satellites. These algal blooms will go on to feed some of those first consumers in the trophic chain. So these are copepods. They don't look like a lot, but you can actually, if you took a strainer and just walk down the beach at random on Hudson Bay, for example, dip your net in, you will find things that look kind of like little shrimpy things, maybe about the size of your pinky fingernail, maybe a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. And these are, along with some other things of the same size, collectively referred to as plankton. This particular one is known sometimes as Arctic feed. It's a really important food source, not just for whales like the bowhead, which will filter feed it, but also for fish, for seabirds. And it contains, for its size, an incredibly large amount of fat. If you look at the middle of those animals, see that kind of shiny looking kind of middle tube? That is their fat storage. So already our very first consumers are already starting to store their excess energy as fat and as large amounts of fat. Again, telling us about that currency of the Arctic. One of the predators on the copepods are capelin. It's a small forage fish. It belongs to the smelt family, and they will swarm up and eat a whole bunch of plankton along the ice shelf. And we care about capelin just like we cared about copepods and all of the plankton, because they go on to feed things like our friendly beluga whale. So beluga whales can eat larger fish than capelin. Capelin are basically sardine size. If you think about opening up a can of sardines, they're about that big. But capelin do represent a major food source, especially when they are spawning and found in great big numbers to beluga whales. And if you think about it, 160,000 beluga whales worldwide need to eat an awful lot of capelin. So they mentioned before that big evolutionary split in the whales. These are toothed whales. Note the teeth on the beluga whales. They are peg-like. They are not cutting teeth or grinding teeth. They are simply for catching capelin and other species like cod or herring or Arctic char, various mollusks and crustaceans. Exactly what a beluga whale eats depends on where it lives and what's around. They're pretty gregarious that way, and they'll take advantage of whatever is around. But they don't dive very far for their food. The longest recorded dive time for a beluga whale is 23 minutes. So they don't feed very deep. We would consider this a very shallow feeding whale, where the deepest dives will be down to around 800 meters, which is around 2,400 feet down. That feels pretty far to us, but in whale terms, it's not very far at all. We know of whales like sperm whales, and some of the beaked whales especially may go a couple of miles down, which is unbelievable, spend a couple of hours down at depth feeding while not breathing before they reemerge. So beluga whales, they really are found in that top part of the water column, creatures of the shallows for sure. So how do they get their mouths on the fish? Well, sometimes they just chomp them like that whale is showing there, but they also have something called labile lips. It's one of those fun terms that doesn't make a lot of sense. Labile means lip-like, so they have lip-like lips. I guess they're human lip-like lips. They're able to move them around and pucker them, and they can blow bubbles, and they can also suck in, water jets or blow out water jets. That lets them actually suck up things like squid or mollusks or fish into their mouth, and then they get trapped by their teeth. So pretty fun things. Beluga whales do some bubble blowing for communication. They think it might be to do also with, like, why is this guy blowing bubbles? Well, it can be just due to communication. They could be playing. They're very playful creatures. And amazingly, beluga whales are estimated to devote around 1/3 of their time to play. It seems like things like bubble blowing and other activities like that can provide opportunities for social bonding. They'll actually sometimes blow bubbles at each other to have the other one pop it, or they'll blow bubbles at each other. So really interesting things. So getting back to feeding now, how do they find those fish? Well, they are, again, very well evolved for what they do. So that big division 30 million years ago gave us the toothed whales, which have echolocation. These are like our beluga whales here. And whenever you see a beluga whale skull, it's sometimes a little bit disconcerting because it doesn't represent the head shape that we think of for a beluga whale. You look here at the kind of the speckled bit on the image, that is the skull. And the thing that makes the beluga whale kind of have a head in the forehead, that's something called a melon. And the melon is an acoustic lens that's able to focus sound waves coming out of the nasal sacs. So if you look at the image there, the top one there, the top word says nasal sacs, and it's pointing down at this cavity that sits at the front of the skull and behind the melon. And this is really like a modified set of lips. It's able to go bzz and buzz like a trombone player, like a trumpet player would make noise, analogous to that. And then that noise is shaped by the melon and how they can move the melon to focus those sound waves to bounce off where it might be an ice shelf, or it might be a rock, or it might be other whales, or it might be a school of fish that's ahead of them. They then receive those sound waves as it bounces off that object, whatever it might be, and the sound waves are received through fluid-filled cavities in their lower jaw that then conduct the sound waves up to that internal ear structure I was talking about earlier. There are over 1,200 distinct vocalizations that have been picked up by humans researching beluga whales, everything from clicks and screams to whistles. There are a number of sounds that have been picked up as very distinct sounds. So things like contact calls, where they're able to, like a mother, for example, is able to reach out and call their child, and their child has a sound, a contact call that is associated with it. And that's, again, it's just so cool to me that we can start to understand at least a little bit of what one species of whale is able to say. And there is active research happening on beluga whale calls. One of the researchers is at the Vancouver Aquarium, Dr. Vergara, who's identified at least 28 different calls that she has translated and can give distinct names to what those calls mean. All right, cute picture coming up. Here we go. And as you may be able to tell, this is a picture of a beluga whale in captivity. The reason I chose to use a couple of photos from captivity is just because it's sometimes very difficult to get good images like this of a mother and calf, especially in the wild. So hence the aquarium photo here. And because most of what we know of the life cycle actually comes from captive whales. So these are our whales. They are beautiful. The newborns are born. They are around 30 to 50% of the mother's body length. And they will mature over something like 6 to 12 years. And males mature a little bit faster than the females do. When they do reach sexual maturity at that point, that's when they've moved from being that dark color at the newborn stage all the way up to that very pale white color that they get as adults. And they will breed. Gestation period is around 14.5 months, and calving tends to happen in offshore warm waters in early summer. And this often happens in estuaries or in areas really close to estuary inlets. It's very rarely seen by humans. And there's a lot of question marks that we still have around the beluga whale lifespan and life cycle. We even have a question mark about how long they can live. If you read current estimates, it says something like 45 to 60 years in the wild. Question mark, maybe significantly longer. Could be 80 or up to 100 years. We have real questions about the method that we use to date beluga whales. So we're still learning a lot about how long they can live, but it looks to be like they are sexually mature around the same age a human is, give or take. They go into menopause roughly around the same age a human goes into menopause, and they die around the same age a human dies. So their life cycle is pretty darn analogous to a human life cycle. And they do produce some awfully cute babies. So this is often one of the highlights that is seen on trip is in the early part of the summer is when calving generally happens, and newborn beluga whales, unlike the adults, are much less able to breathe easily. So they actually have to stick their whole head up out of the water to breathe, unlike the gentle roll that adults are able to do. So you will often see a little head popping out as it goes right beside its mother within the first few days of it being born. Here's another young close to the mothers here. And you can see that the calves do stick very close to their mums. Okay, so here, next slide coming up here is our worldwide population. Mentioned it's around 150,000. Around 2/3 of those are found in Canada, estimates up to about 90,000 individuals in Canada. And when we go on trip with NatHab, we are visiting the Western Hudson Bay population, marked there with a star at the location of Churchill. We have at least 7 populations of beluga whales in Canada. A couple of them are considered to be endangered or threatened. The Western Hudson Bay population is not at all. So it's considered, again, to be of least concern and is doing very, very well. So by Canadian standards, we call it not at risk. So they're a very robust population with very, very few threats. And the threats that have been identified for the Western Hudson Bay population specifically have to do with sea noise. So there's our Western or our Hudson Bay. And zooming in here to show you what they do. So the black area is their summering zone. Remember I said that some of the populations were migratory. We only see beluga whales in Churchill from usually late June into mid-August would be when I'd say the peak of the beluga season is done, but we will see some stragglers up until the end of September or even into early October. And the Churchill population is around 3,500 to estimates up to 5,000 whales. They do a migration, so they will actually head north into the Hudson Strait throughout the winter. So that's just a picture there because you got to show some more beluga whale pictures. They're just great. And they can be very interested in what's going on. We see them in Churchill quite a bit, and we see them showing their social structure. So this is an example of a large pod. And when I look at this pod, I say, aha, I know what sex these whales are. And you say, oh, Eleanor, how do you know that? Because they're so far away. Well, because these are all a single age class. They are all white whales. Therefore, they're all sexually mature whales. Therefore, they are all males. You will have two types of pods in all beluga whale populations, the males, so sexually mature males, and then the mothers and associated calves. And they will often keep their calves around for a number of years. They'll bond up with other females, but the female and family pods and the male pods tend not to spend much of any time together. But it makes for some very easy interpretation of what we're seeing. Just to kind of give you an idea here about boat noise, an interesting thing that I found and that many of us have found working up there is that Canada treats every single population of beluga whales as different management units because every population has different potential stresses on it. The Churchill population isn't facing issues around not having enough food, it isn't facing issues around pollution, it isn't facing issues around hunting, but we do see some potential issues around boat noise. Now, interestingly, because these whales have not been negatively interacted with in the Churchill area for generations of whales, they are actually mildly attracted to the boats and they like to come over and see what's going on, meaning that it's often that it feels just as much like a human watching tour on behalf of the belugas as it does a whale watching tour on behalf of the humans. Now, other populations do face some more risks, and part of the reasons that we're seeing concern and something that WWF is actively working on with whales and mitigating noises is that as we start to see declining ice cover, that gives more potential for noisy boats to come through. And when you are an animal who sees the world through noises, you can imagine it would be like me trying to get you to walk around a forest while I'm flashing a strobe light in your eyes the whole time. It's very difficult to maneuver. It's very difficult to feed. It might be difficult to find a mate. So shipping is a major potential impact. And these images here are just showing you what the expected routes are as we start to see a decline over time in the amount of sea ice. And unfortunately, this does nearly overlap completely with a lot of those important summering habitats of the beluga whales. I'm not going to go too into detail on some of the WWF impacts because I think it's really kind of fun to go explore the website, and because it's almost the end of the webinar and I want to leave some things for you to explore. But this is an active area where WWF is working at reducing the impacts of shipping on all northern marine mammals, and this includes beluga whales. And one of the ways this is happening is looking at rerouting boat vessels and just doing this through education of why the need is to reroute boat vessels. I think everybody who lives and works up north can agree that we want animals to be around for a very long time and we want them to do well. And when it's easily done and it's just a matter of taking your boat that way instead of that way, nearly everybody is in favor of it. So being able to pass around navigational maps and areas to stay away from at different times of year can be incredibly helpful to local populations who are doing their very best to mitigate any problems around whales or other marine mammals. Now, there are other populations that do face other risks that actually don't have that much to do with humans, and this is to do with other predation by other marine mammals. The polar bears are known to take beluga whales, and this is how they do it on the left-hand side here. They look for an area where the ice is closed in unexpectedly, and they will whales are then forced to use this breathing hole, and polar bears, if they come across this, are then able to take advantage of this kind of captive population of beluga whales and wear them down by just swiping at them until one becomes too exhausted and they can pull it out. Interestingly, and I think maybe that's not really something that a lot of us were aware of, is that increasing summer temperatures is allowing orcas to make it into areas where they have never been before, at least in human memory. And to the point that there is no word in local indigenous languages for orcas, yet here are the orcas eating the belugas. So we are starting to see more and more of them coming up as well. Very, very rare for them to make it down into Hudson Bay because, as noted, these are not whales that are adapted for the ice. They have to be gone by the time the ice comes in. So they tend to go actually further up north, not all the way down into Hudson Bay, and they will hunt belugas and narwhals in some of the inlets around Baffin Island, for example. So interesting changes there. This is a population of beluga whales in the St. Lawrence River, and you may know of the St. Lawrence belugas because they are one of the more at-risk populations, along with the population up in Alaska, primarily through historical overhunting and then risks due to shipping. So while there are challenges for beluga whales, there are a lot of things we can do, and part of that is just becoming more aware of beluga whales and how we use the areas if you're in somewhere where beluga whales exist. And you can actually do some education and learning from your very home. And this is through a program called Beluga Bits. It's run, it's got a number of supporters, but it actually happens just in Churchill. And it happens on this boat right here. So in the summer months when NatHab is out in Churchill looking at beluga whales, this boat or a boat very similar to it will also be out looking at beluga whales. And they take both an above ground live stream and above water live stream and a below water live stream, which you can watch from the comfort of your own home just for fun, or you can use it to find identifying characteristics of these whales. And what researchers have been able to do with this is actually using completely non-invasive methods, track population structure, track survivorship, track number of calves who return at the each year, and get a really good idea of how that population is doing as they maybe are starting to see more stresses, for example, with boats coming in, or if there's anything that happens in a certain year that's different. We are getting information just by this webcam that then live streams to people like you and me who are willing to sit there, click onto the program and register as a helper and say, okay, that's a male, that's a female, it's this old. And you get all the training with that if you like to go through it. It's an interesting thing that you can do from your own home and is a fun way to get to see beluga whales even if you're not coming on trip this year, and is a nice way to stay connected to them if you have been on trip and seen beluga whales. So it's a great way to learn as well. And this project is actually going to be branching out and using the same images to look at jellyfish in the Churchill River as well, which is one of the prey species for belugas in the area. So lots of interesting stuff going on. I hope you've love looking at pictures of beluga whales as much as I've liked finding them for you. And I know I'm very sorry to have gone a little bit over, but beluga whales are just so exciting. I will hand things back to Rob here for questions. My apologies, Rob. Just too many whales.
Hey, no worries. You answered a lot of questions already. So before we get to some questions, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit questions via the question field on your control panel. So let's just get to a few real quick. So can narwhals and belugas interbreed?
Great question. And the answer is Yes, and we have a very definite answer on that because we have had at least 3 known hybrids. Um, they they were hunted, and so the skulls were actually, presented to researchers as a, hey, what do you think this is? I think it's that. And they were given the very unfortunate name of a narluga. They have characteristics that are kind of midway in between a beluga and a narwhal, and it looks like they feed more like narwhals do, from what we can tell, because of the strange, like twisty teeth that they ended up getting. They weren't able to easily feed the way a beluga whale did, so they were more like a narwhal. They dove further down and fed deeper in the water column with a different feeding strategy.
Very interesting. Wow.
Hmm.
So their eyes are very small. Do we know why this is? And can they see in the dark?
Their eyes are very small, and I would say they're likely not able to see in the dark any better and probably worse than you or I. But what they have that makes up for that is the echolocation. Within the water column, assuming it's daylight, you've only got about the first, about 300 meters or so that you're going to get light penetration to the point where you can see anything. And below that, it's all dark. And beluga whales will feed below that point anyway, so they're clearly able to navigate in complete darkness. And at times of year, like they may be in an area where they have a 24-hour, they may have a 6-month day and a 6-month night, and they're still able to navigate just fine given that. We think based on the anatomy and the physiology that has been determined from the eye structure and from the brain structure, that when they are above water, they can see, I was going to say about as well as you or I, probably as well as me because I need glasses. So they can see, but not super duper well and not at a distance, especially above water. But every so often you do get one popping up and spy hopping and having a look above the water before it comes back down.
Do we know why their eyes are so low on their head?
Do we know? Okay, so it seems like they are low, right? And it looks like they're low. And I've done some artwork with belugas, and you keep having to put the eyes lower than you think, because otherwise it's not right. But remember, the whole top of that skull is not skull at all. It's that squishy melon. And their eyes would actually be in a position that's not very different from where yours or my eye would be in terms of the skull, but it's got the rest of that melon on top of it that's making its head look bigger than it actually is.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. So what about their teeth? It doesn't look like they have that many teeth. Do they just tend to swallow their prey, or do they chew a lot? Or are there more teeth than we see?
No, that's a good question as well. I think the image I had one with the whale's mouth open, and that was pretty typical. There's a little bit of variation in terms of how many teeth they have, just like some humans have a few more teeth than others. They are not chewers. They exclusively use their teeth for holding food in their mouth. And because they're also able to suction prey, the thinking is that if you have an older beluga who maybe has some cracked teeth or has lost some teeth, it's likely not going to impact their ability to feed themselves a whole lot. Like they overlap significantly with the narwhal um, in terms of what kind of food they eat, though the narwhal have a slightly different feeding strategy. The narwhal have no teeth in their mouth. They're still a toothed whale because they have that tusk, but they're able to do just fine in the Arctic with no teeth whatsoever, so very likely a beluga whale would be just fine too.
Do we know why they turn white? What advantage does that offer?
So we see this coloration. It's sometimes called cryptic coloration. You see it in other animals as well. It's really just fitting in with the environments. And because they are in a predominantly ice-filled environment, the thinking is that they're less likely to be seen by other predators, as well as less likely to be seen by their prey species if they blend in with the ice. There's some other, like a lot of whales, if you go and look at a picture of many whales that are found higher up in the water, they often have at least a white belly so that if you're a fish looking up, all you're seeing is pale sky or pale belly. And if you're something looking down, you see the darkness usually. But because beluga whales have ice around them, it's advantageous to them, presumably, to be white all over.
Do we know if belugas have twins or triplets or anything like that?
We know to the point of being able to say there are no known examples of twins. However, we know from a whole host of other animals that when we say that, we're often proven wrong. So the guess, my personal guess, as well as the best guess of researchers, would be that um, if twins do happen, they're very, very unlikely and probably much less likely to survive. What beluga whale mothers will do, though, is they will actually, when they nurse, if they are in a pod with other mums who are also nursing their calves, they will nurse other mothers' calves. So you will sometimes see a mom who looks like she's got 2 or 3 babies, but very likely it's that her friend is off eating somewhere and she's just looking after the babies while her friend's gone. Not that she's got 2 or 3 of her own that she's nursing at the same time.
Thank you for that. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Oh, thanks everybody for coming in today, and thanks for my thanks for having patience while I talk for too long about beluga whales and just a little snapshot of what we talk about on a beluga whale trip and all the wonderful things we can see. They're endlessly fascinating animals, and I'm so excited that it's almost beluga whale time of year. Thank you all so much, and I hope you're having a great day, and thanks, Rob.
Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.